Hello and welcome to the channel. You can call me Ray, although I also go by Dark Horse Zero. In this video I'd like to go over some of the gesture drawings I did in the last month. I want to talk about my process for drawing gestures, what kind of mistakes I tend to make, and how I identify and learn from those mistakes. Hopefully some of that will be useful or instructive to watch. So I did about 60 gesture drawings this month, which you can see going by on screen. They were supposed to be 2-minute gestures, but I kind of spent way too much time on most of them, which is kind of a bad habit that I'm trying to fix. So the references I use are from a site called Posemaniacs, which has basically 3D anatomical models which are all muscle, fat and bone without any skin. You can rotate the 3D model in a 3D viewer, you can switch between male and female version. There's a bunch of good options and there's a lot of poses, which is why I like using this site and I've been using it for a pretty long time. Okay, so this is the first one. I'm going to be speeding up the footage to about 3 times speed so we can go through these quicker. And this first pose is already pretty tough. There's a handstand with one hand going on, one of the legs is coming out towards us, the other leg is bent away, the body is twisted and you can only see the top of the head. There's a lot going on here and I don't do a great job with this, but we can at least look at some of the more obvious mistakes and see how this could have been done better. So one of the mistakes I made here is that I drew the left shoulder, the lower one, a little too big. Because of that I ended up drawing that arm a bit too big too. The other mistake here is that I tried to make this head like round, because usually I draw a round head and then I draw the jaw attached to it, but in this case it's supposed to be oval because you're looking at it from the top. Here I realized that the torso is a bit too small and I tried to adjust things around to make it look a bit better. And it doesn't improve that much, but it's still a bit better than before, right? Here I draw some wrapping lines to indicate the side against the front of the body. Here I try to indicate the back. And here I realized that this leg does not look great, but I don't really know what to do about it, so I kind of just give up on it. More wrapping lines, and eventually I realized that that arm is too big, and thankfully I can just shrink it down and it's better. I think the upper body looks fine for this one, but the lower body does not look very good. Okay, so the second one is not gonna take very long because the mistake in this one is gonna be very obvious. You see that neck that I drew here? It's too vertical. If you look at the reference, really you don't even see the neck much, you just see the back and it's supposed to be curved. So that's one mistake. The other mistake is similar with the legs now. I drew them too vertical. The knee actually comes a bit forwards from the body, so that should have been rotated a bit. So that's 2 mistakes here. Everything else I don't think I drew that wrong, but because of those 2 mistakes the overall pose just looks very off. So it's important to get those angles correct. So the third one here is an interesting case where if you just looked at the end result you might think that it looks fine, but there's still a couple of mistakes that I make here. First mistake is over here with this leg. Similar issue as last time, it's actually a bit too horizontal compared to the reference in which the leg is tilted downwards a bit. Now you might also say that the arm that I draw here is also not quite the right angle and it's supposed to be more vertical if you look at the reference. I don't think it's as big of an issue though. The bigger issue here is this line that I draw that divides the abdomen into 2 parts. In my drawing, the abdomen, both sides of the abdomen are clearly visible to the viewer or the camera, but in the reference only one side is actually visible, the other side of the abdomen is like obscured. So that's one issue, and that's something that I do often whenever I have an area like this. I end up dividing it evenly when I should actually look a bit more closely to see if one side is more visible than the other. Otherwise I think the pose looks fine and I just resize it to fit within the bounds. Here's another difficult pose. Remember that site I told you about where I get these poses, the Posemaniacs one? So it has a feature where it just gives you random poses to draw and I use that to get most of my poses. It has a difficulty setting and I usually just leave it at easy. And these are the kinds of poses it gives me. Now maybe my standards are weird here, but I don't think this is exactly an easy pose. Anyway, I think most of my mistakes in this one come down to proportion and placement. Both of my legs and my arm are gonna be too small here, and also my left leg is a bit too high, it should be a bit lower. And I want to talk about how I learned to spot some of these issues. So for me it comes down to looking at my drawing and then looking at the reference and comparing the relative placement of different parts and the relative proportions. So I'll check where the hand is in comparison to the head, where the hips are in comparison to the knees, stuff like that, and how much space there is between different parts. And then I'll check how big the hand is in comparison to the head, and I'll see are the feet equal in size or is one bigger because it's closer, stuff like that. At first I was bad at it, but over time I became more and more accurate. I think it's mostly just a matter of putting in time until you develop that sense basically. Alright, I'm actually gonna start skipping around a lot more to show just the mistakes because this might take too long otherwise. The mistake here is that the line I draw from the shoulder to the back does not drop as much as it should. It's actually pretty steep in the reference, but mine is just too shallow here. That's the first mistake. The second mistake here is this back muscle that I draw is actually a little bit too big. It covers too much space. I realized later on that it doesn't quite look right, the pose doesn't look right, but I'm not able to identify that it's the back muscle that's the issue. I'm not really able to fix it. Another thing I'd like to talk about is wrapping lines. So drawing wrapping lines around your body can help communicate its orientation and just give it a sense of volume. I especially like to use wrapping lines for the side of the body because it helps differentiate it from the front and the back, which can be kind of difficult otherwise. One issue that I run into, however, is that sometimes I can't quite tell if something is actually coming out towards me or going away. I had that issue with the upper arm over here. I couldn't really tell if it was coming out or going away, but eventually I figured it out. Oh, this one I actually messed up pretty bad. The first mistake here is obviously that left shoulder, it just looks utterly horrible. The second mistake is actually a bit hard to notice, and I wasn't able to notice it when I was drawing it. It's actually that the torso is a bit too long vertically. In the reference you can see the torso is actually kind of curved, which means it's a bit shorter than it would normally be. And this is a common mistake I tend to make. I tend to draw torsos a bit longer vertically than they really should be. And in this case, because everything is coming off the torso at different angles, everything else also looks bad because of it, and I'm never really able to fix it because I never noticed the original issue. Oh, this is an interesting case where I actually noticed my mistakes and then I fixed them. And I actually want to talk about why I think fixing your mistakes is actually an important part of learning. But first of all, let's focus on the mistake here, and maybe you noticed it already because I already made this mistake before. My legs here are too horizontal. So in the reference you can tell that the legs actually go downwards a bit, going from the knee to the ankles. But mine are too horizontal, and I actually notice it when I'm drawing around them because I'm like, why isn't there any space between my legs? Because there's supposed to be space between the legs if you look at the reference. Because of that I'm able to notice what the mistake is, and then I'm able to fix it with some edits, just rotate it around a bit. There you go. Okay, so these will be the last two gestures that I cover, and I'm not gonna point out the mistakes directly anymore. I'll just put some text and an arrow on screen whenever they happen. And now I want to continue what I was saying before about fixing mistakes being an important part of learning. And just to bear in mind that this is coming from the perspective of someone who's mostly just self-learning art. So if you have someone to give you feedback, this may not all apply. When I was first learning gesture drawings, one of the resources I was using actually said that it's better not to try to fix gesture drawings if they don't turn out well. And the reason for that was basically that they're mostly for practice and they're not really final drawings that you're gonna show anyone. So it's better to just move on to a new one instead of trying to fix old ones. I thought that sort of made sense, so I actually used that approach for a while. But over time I noticed that my gestures weren't really improving and I was just making a whole lot of really bad gestures. And I could tell that they were bad. I could put my drawings next to the references and think, okay, this looks wrong somehow, but I'm not exactly sure how. I could make some guesses, but then I wouldn't really know if I'm right or not. And since that approach didn't work for me, I figured I might as well try fixing the mistakes and seeing how that goes. So what I did was, every time my gesture drawing started to look wrong, I'd move stuff, rotate, redraw, and just adjust things until it looked better. And if it did look better, then now I knew what the mistake was. And once I know, I can be more careful the next time I'm doing a gesture. Because if you make a mistake without knowing what it is, you probably make that mistake a whole bunch of times instead of just one. But once you know, you can be more conscious of it and hopefully prevent it from happening in the first place. If I know that I tend to draw my torsos too long in my gestures, the next time I draw a torso, I can draw it a bit shorter. And this doesn't always just work immediately. It takes a few tries before you're really able to internalize it and stop making that mistake. I feel like it's worked pretty well for me so far. I definitely think I've improved in my gesture drawings ever since I started actively fixing my mistakes. Even in this gesture, I actually made a whole bunch of mistakes. My head is still too small and I fixed it over here. And my leg was too long, I fixed that, and eventually it turned into a good gesture, right? I could have just given up on it from the start and let it be bad, but I think doing it this way is a little bit better, because at least I learned something from it. Also, I kinda like the combination of this gesture with the one on the right. Like guy's out here on his knee trying to propose and this woman's just ready to kick some ass. It's kind of funny, I like it. So that's gonna be all the gestures I looked at for today. I've been dedicating time to gesture drawings for several months now, so I think I'm fairly decent at them, at least at conveying a pose. But there's always room to grow, and I try to identify my mistakes so I can improve on them and stop making them in the first place. I should also mention I'm following Mark Brunette's 1-year plan for these. So I did 60 gesture drawings in May, which were supposed to be 2 minutes, but again, I went over for a lot of them. I'm not following the whole plan because 1, I'm not really good at following a schedule, and 2, I have other things besides art I spend time on. Lastly, I want to summarize some of my most common mistakes that I made in these and other gestures I drew in this month. The biggest one by far has to be proportions and placement. I just draw some things too big or too small relative to everything else. Sometimes I draw things completely horizontal or vertical when they shouldn't be, and vice versa. The next one is that I don't pay enough attention to which parts of a surface are actually facing the viewer and which ones are obscured. That's why I end up just dividing some areas evenly. Lastly, I just spent way too much time on these gestures. They were supposed to be 2-minute gestures, but I took closer to like 6 or 8 minutes if I include all the mistakes I fixed. I do have an excuse for it. I did 10-minute gesture drawings for April, so it was a bit tough to go back down to drawing them in 2 minutes for May. And I think that will be it. This is my first video on this channel. I've always wanted to make a YouTube channel, but I never quite had the confidence to start. But I'm giving it a try now just to see how it goes. So yeah, thank you for watching and hopefully I'll see you again.